Eagle Song, Chapter 1, Shikhan. Hey, Chief, going home to your teepee? Danny Bigtree clenched his fist but kept walking. The November wind was cold against his face. It blew his long black hair over his eyes. He thought again of cutting it short. If he asked his mother to cut his hair, she might look at him in that way she had. She wouldn't tell him no, though. Even though her eyes might question his decision, he knew she would cut it if he asked. But he knew, too, that even with short hair, he'd still be noticed. The other boys would still say things like that. That's how it always was here in Brooklyn, especially if you were different. Page 8. It would do no good to say, as he had once said to them back in September, "I'm not a chief. We're Iroquois, and we never lived in teepees. We lived in long houses a long time ago, and now I live in an apartment building." They'd just laugh again. Then Tyrone and Brad would ask him where his war pony was. None of the boys followed him. They went back to their basketball game. Danny stopped at the corner and looked back to watch them play. He wasn't really interested in basketball, but the way they played it almost looked like fun. Some of them were really good, especially Tyrone. While Danny watched, Tyrone bounced the ball, cut around two of the other boys, jumped up and threw the ball in a high long arc. It swished down through the basket. Brad, Tyrone's best friend, came over, and the two boys slapped their palms together in a high five. Danny sighed. He'd never played much basketball on the reservation. Lacrosse was his game, but nobody here played lacrosse. Danny found himself thinking again of what it had been like at Akwesasne. The wide St. Lawrence River, he knew it was so polluted from the factories on the Canadian side that no one could fish it anymore, but in his memory it was beautiful. Page 10. Akwesasne, fields and woods to play in, lots of other Indian kids who looked and talked the way he did. Akwesasne. The name was so much better than Brooklyn. Akwesasne meant the place where the partridge drums. He didn't know what Brooklyn meant. There had been plenty of reasons to leave Akwesasne, though. No jobs was one. It was because of the lack of employment that men like his dad traveled all over the country to do ironwork. When his mom had finished her social work degree and been offered the job at the American Indian Community House in Manhattan, she hadn't hesitated. It would be a better life, she'd promised. So far, for Danny, it hadn't been. He went down into the subway entrance, and when he was on the train, he closed his eyes. That way, he wouldn't know if anyone was looking at him. If he kept his eyes closed long enough, he could imagine himself riding on the back of an eagle that would take him away from Brooklyn. It would take him away from the schools and the tenements and people who made fun of him because he wasn't the same as them. Page 11. It would take him to a place where there were other people like him and his parents, a faraway place. If he closed his eyes long enough, the roar of the rumbling wheels would become the sound of the waters of the St. Lawrence River going over the stones. The squeaking of the metal of the car would become the songs of birds. But he couldn't keep his eyes closed too long. If he fell asleep, he might go right by his stop again the way he did last week. Then he wouldn't be able to get home before his mother. She would go to Mrs. Fisher's apartment to pick him up, and he wouldn't be there. His mother wouldn't say anything to him if he came home late, but he'd be able to tell from the look in her eyes that she had been worried. She already worried enough about Dad and the dangerous work he did every day, 50 stories or more above the earth. Danny didn't want to add to her worries, so he let the sounds of the birds and the clear river flow away from him. 2 stops before his station, he opened his eyes, and when the familiar letters that spelled out the name of their neighborhood came into view, he stood up in front of the door and got out onto the platform. Page 12. When he came out of the subway station, he kept his eyes down on the sidewalk, not looking up at the windows. He could imagine people looking at him from those windows, pointing and laughing. Danny reached his building. He put his hand down the neck of his sweatshirt and found the beaded string on which the door key hung. At the top of the stairs, he put up his fist to knock at Mrs. Fisher's door. Their neighbor, a retired lady, gave Danny a snack and kept an eye on him till his mom came home. Sally Bigtree worked until 5 every day at the American Indian Community House. It sometimes took her an hour to get home from there by subway. Danny usually did his homework and then watched TV with Mrs. Fisher while he waited for her. But down the hall, the door to his own apartment swung open. He saw two things that brought a smile to his face. The first was his mother, home from work much earlier than usual. She had opened the door for him, and a very big smile was on her face. The second thing Danny saw as he hurried through the doorway was the hard hat placed on the table just inside the door. Painted on the steelworker's cap was a wide-winged eagle sitting on top of a big pine tree. "Dad is home," Danny said. "In the shower," his mother said. "His crew got done on that building in Boston early. He came to the community house to surprise me. Rosemary told me to take the rest of the day off. I was all through writing my proposal anyway." Danny's mother cocked her head as she looked at him. "You are grinning like a raccoon," she said. "So are you," said Danny. "So am I," said his mother. Then she leaned over and hugged him so hard that his feet came off the ground. Danny hugged her too and let her lift him up. His mother was very strong. She was almost 6 feet tall, taller than his father. He thought about how his father always teased his mother about her strength, teased her in a way that made her feel good, even though she would pretend to ignore him. "Careful there, you're going to break his ribs," boomed a voice as deep and familiar as the beat of a drum. Richard Bigtree came out of the bathroom, still drying his own long hair. That hair was as crow-black as Danny's, except for the places it was flecked with white on his temples. Danny's father was bare-chested and built like a bear. His body was as strong and as round as the trunk of a big pine tree. Danny's mother dropped him, and Danny ran over to hug his father. "Shikan," his father said, speaking the Mohawk word of greeting, the word for peace. "Shikan," Danny answered, a little catch in his voice as he said it. "You know why Iroquois men always listen to women, son," his voice said, his arm around Danny. "No, Dad. Why?" Danny said, going along with the joke. "It isn't just that they are usually wiser than men," his dad said. Then he paused again. Danny's turn. "It isn't, Dad? And it isn't just that the women own the households and choose the chiefs." "It isn't, Dad?" "No. You know what it is, Dancing Eagle, my son." Danny almost laughed then. Whenever his dad talked that way, his face deadpan, his voice imitating a Hollywood Indian, it was time for the punchline. Danny knew what to say next. "No, my father. What is it?" "We Iroquois men always listen to women because if we don't, they will beat us up. Look out, here comes one now." Danny's mother grabbed his dad, pushed him back onto the floor, and began to tickle him. "Help me, my son," his dad cried in a high, funny voice. Danny jumped in to help. Somehow, it ended up with both his mother and his father tickling him. Then, when he had laughed so much it started to hurt, the three of them just stayed there on the floor, their arms around each other. "It's so much fun when Dad is here," Danny thought. "Mom doesn't seem so tired when she comes home after work. Why can't it be like this all the time?" But he knew his father's job would take him away again for weeks and weeks. He knew, too, that he would be back in school tomorrow. Back in that school where no one else was like him, where he had no friends and no one noticed him except to make fun of him. Eagle Song. Chapter 1, Shikhan.